Hi guys, thanks so much for joining me for another video. So this video will continue our discussion of survey research. And for this particular video, I'm going to take you through the process, right? So I'm going to imagine that we are all researchers who are beginning the process of administering a survey based on our particular research question. Right? So there's a variety of things that we need to do prior to actually creating and administering our survey. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so one of the things, I have a couple of questions that I want you guys to consider before we get started. So for example, I want you to think about what kind of people might be more likely to join a sorority, right? Or a Greek organization. So maybe you yourself have joined a sorority or a fraternity, or you know a lot of people who have joined sororities. So maybe think about the particular qualities of that person that maybe made them more likely to make that decision. Right? And a related question is, what type of social needs might joining a Greek organization satisfy for a person? Right? So we all are socially developing creatures. We're highly social creatures. And so we have a variety of needs in that domain that need to be met. So what are some examples of those kind of social needs that might be met by joining a Greek organization? Okay, another question is, what type of psychological needs might joining a Greek organization satisfy? Right? So think about maybe some of the things that I listed off in my last video. Right? So for example, extroversion versus introversion is an example of a personality trait. But we also have a variety of psychological needs that might need to be met, right? So maybe a desire for a sense of belonging or a desire for a sense of self-efficacy, right? And how do people gain a sense of self or who they are? Right? So one of the most important questions that students begin to answer when they're in college is, who am I? Right? So how might joining groups help you to cultivate or define a sense of self? Right? So our particular research question that I've tried to preview there is there an association between students' sense of self and their interest in joining a fraternity or sorority? Okay. Okay, so you might have noticed throughout your life that when asked, who are you, right? Some people struggle to come up with the answer, right? So they have trouble coming up with a definition, okay, of who they are, while others can rattle off an answer with seemingly little effort, right? So for some people, they have no trouble thinking about and defining who they are, whereas other people have maybe more of a inconsistency or fractured sense of self. Right? So when we talk about self-concept clarity, which is already a construct that psychological researchers have investigated and defined for us, is we're talking about how clearly, confidently, and consistently people can describe their sense of self. Right? So for me, when asked who I am, I would probably say, first, I'm a psychologist. Second, maybe I'm a scientist. And maybe third, something like I'm a survivor, right? So I'm a person who has triumphed over a lot of adversity, right? So those are the core tenets of how I might define myself. But like I said, for a lot of people, who they are might change dramatically depending on the circumstances, or they might just have kind of a vague sense of who they are, right? Okay, so we already have a survey or questionnaire that we can administer to assess self-concept clarity, right? And one other thing I want to mention is that here, what I've written on the slide is a conceptual definition of self-concept, right? So how clearly, confidently, and consistently people can describe their sense of self, that's a conceptual definition, right? So our operational definition is again going to tell people how did we measure these variables so that they themselves can conduct a similar sort of study, right? So the operational or the operational definition would be the actual questionnaire, right? So participants completed a questionnaire evaluating their self-concept, and then you would include maybe some of the items that you used or the name of the questionnaire. Okay. But we actually have a variable that we need to define and that we need to create, right? So our conceptual definition is going to be interest in joining a fraternity or sorority, okay? And our more precise definition, or the beginnings of an operational definition, is we're defining interest as anyone who has a generally positive attitude about joining a Greek organization. Right? But we still need to create our survey that will help us to assess this variable. Okay, so an important question we need to ask before we move forward, right? So we have our research question, and we have we've operationalized our variables, but we still need to figure out what type of research design we should use. And we also need to think about what our results might look like. So we need to pick a research design, and we also need to formalize our hypotheses. Okay, so let's think for a moment, right? We are essentially trying to figure out if two variables are related or if there's an association between two variables, right? So whenever we're looking at the association between two variables, we're going to want to employ a correlational design. Okay, so a correlational design, like I said, focuses on how variables relate to each other, right? But it has important limitations, right? All we're talking about with a correlational study is a relationship. We do not know the direction of the relationship, and we don't know anything about causality, right? So we're just trying to determine if there is an association between two different variables, right? So whenever we conduct a correlational research design, essentially the metric that we're interested in is something called the Pearson R, right? So whenever we're trying to measure the strength of a relationship and the direction of a relationship between two variables, right, we have two indices for that. So the Pearson R, which in this example is 0.80, is going to tell us how strong the relationship between two variables is. And that indice ranges between -1 and +1, right? So an R of 0.80 would be a very, very strong positive relationship, right? And when we talk about the direction of the relationship, we can indicate that with either a positive sign or a negative sign, right? So a positive relationship between two variables means that as one goes up, the other goes up, or as one goes down, the other goes down, right? So it's a direct relationship between two variables, whereas a negative sign means that there's an inverse relationship, whereas one variable increases, the other decreases, or vice versa. Okay? So in the context of this research question, we are going to conduct a correlational design. Okay, so next we have to evaluate our hypotheses, or we have to formalize a hypothesis about what we think the potential relationship between these two variables might be, right? So the first step in developing a hypothesis, right, in the context of contemporary research, is going to be to conduct a literature review, or to try and find as many articles about the variables that we're interested in as possible, so that we can make an informed prediction in our hypotheses, right? So this particular paper by Atlas and Morier was interested in examining how women who want to join a sorority might differ from those that don't. Okay, so they surveyed 109 first-year students during the first week of school, and again 2 and 3 and 7 months later. Okay, so essentially what they found is that women who were interested in joining a sorority tended to have a higher need for exhibitionism, which is just a personality trait that measures how much you desire to be the center of attention, to have an audience, and things like that, right? But they did not have a higher need for affiliation, right? So they weren't more likely than women who weren't interested in joining a sorority to greatly enjoy being around people or fostering social relationships, okay? They were more willing to attend parties where they didn't necessarily fit in. Okay, so that's kind of an indication of self-concept clarity and being confident in who you are, even when you're around people who differ from you. Okay, and these women tended to have more confidence in their social skills, so to speak, or higher social self-esteem, but not overall higher self-esteem. Okay, so that tells us a lot about the individuals who might be more likely to join a sorority or a Greek organization. Okay. Similarly, in this particular study, they wanted to look at individual differences between people who did and did not want to join a Greek organization, right? So the objective was the same as the previous study. And what they found is that students who were interested in joining a sorority tended to be more extroverted. And they also, in terms of their objectives for what they wanted to do in college, they tended to place a lot of value on having fun and maybe attending some parties. And relatedly, they were more likely to engage in risky behaviors, particularly those involving the use of substances. Okay. So one of the hypotheses of these particular researchers is that maybe these individuals were more likely to want to join a sorority because they could satisfy some of their social needs, and also kind of their impulsivity, right? Or their desire to seek out things like alcohol and drugs and things like that, and engage in those more risky behaviors, right? So if those are intrinsic motivations that you have, then you're more likely to want to join a Greek organization. Okay. Next one, these particular researchers were also interested in differences between students in Greek organizations and not in Greek organizations. And they were looking at self-efficacy and academic performance. So self-efficacy just measures how strongly you believe that you can achieve a desired goal. okay? And academic performance is obviously, we all sort of know what that is, right? And they found generally that self-efficacy was significantly higher for students in a Greek organization, right? So we see more extroversion, we see more self-efficacy, we see perhaps more confidence in a social situation. So these are some variables that tend to be characteristic of individuals who join these organizations. Okay, and lastly, this was a widely distributed survey that again was looking at differences between So this particular study was interested in how joining a sorority may influence changes in students over their 4 years of college, right? So these students completed a survey right before they started their first year and also the semester that they graduated. And again, the students were categorized as either having joined a sorority, having joined but no longer been involved, or people who have never had an affiliation with a Greek organization. And they found that the students who were involved in Greek organizations consistently tended to be less independent, okay, relative to, for example, their parents. So they also assessed their parents on these variables and other family members as well as their peers. And this difference was greater when comparing freshmen, okay, which suggests that these differences existed before the students made the decision to join a Greek organization, right? So again, a fundamental difference between individuals who join Greek organizations and those who don't tends to be that they're less independent. All right, so now we are going to begin the process of constructing our survey or writing our survey questions. But before we get started doing that, I would like you to think about or start thinking about what your hypothesis would be based on what we've learned about people who want to join a sorority. Right? So for example, we know that individuals who join a sorority are high in extroversion, meaning they value being around other people and forging social relationships. We know that they are high in self-efficacy, meaning they are confident in their ability to overcome challenges. We know that they're more willing to, for example, attend parties and engage in potentially risky behaviors with substance abuse. And we know that they have high social self-esteem, right? So one of the things that they value most about themselves is how they fare when it comes to engaging with their peers, right? So based on these characteristics, do you think it is more likely that we'll see a positive correlation between self-concept clarity and desire to join a Greek organization? Okay, so the higher you are in self-concept clarity, the higher you are in your desire to join a Greek organization, or will there be a negative correlation? Okay, so think about that and start to develop your own hypothesis. So is there a positive relationship between our variables, or is there a direct relationship, or is there a negative or inverse relationship? Okay, so start thinking about that. Okay, so before we start looking at potential questions for our survey, we need to think about the potential types of questions we might ask, right? So one option is we could ask what are called open-ended questions. So whenever we ask an open-ended question, we are inviting our respondents to answer using their own words. So they're not actually choosing a predetermined set of responses. They're creating their own response, right? So for example, we could simply ask them, how clear is your self-concept? Or are you interested in joining a fraternity or sorority, right? So there are a lot of advantages to open-ended questions. One of the key advantages is that they give us more information, right? So because they allow our respondent to expand upon perhaps why they're interested in joining a fraternity or sorority, or talking about what their appraisal of who they are might be, right? They're going to give us a richer supply of information that we can use to maybe hone our hypothesis and look at our results in more detail. And respondents might also provide additional information that the researchers didn't even consider when they developed these questions, right? But there are also disadvantages or cons that we have to consider. So for example, open-ended questions are much more time-consuming. So you might imagine if you come in to participate in a study, if you have to answer all of these questions and talk extensively about each one, that's going to be a longer process than it would be if you were choosing from a preset response. And it's also time-consuming for the researcher, right? And on a related note, it's also very difficult to score or code or analyze open-ended questions, right? Whereas it's fairly simple to create a score and analyze survey data when there's a constrained set of responses for our respondents to choose from, right? So we also have the option of doing closed-ended questions where respondents answer using predetermined response options, right? So for example, on a scale from 1 to 7, how clear is your self-concept, right? Those might be closed-ended questions we might ask. And there's a lot of advantages. Like I said, they're quick for both the respondent and the researcher. They're easy to analyze. And we can also force our respondents to address a question they might not have spontaneously mentioned with open-ended, right? So closed-ended questions are very, very clear. And it's obvious from the respondent's view what we want them to answer. Whereas if they were providing an open-ended answer, they might not have thought about that particular issue. Disadvantages are that we can only get responses to the questions we've asked, so we can't get any other information from the respondent. And a related issue is that our respondents might engage in what's called satisficing. So satisficing occurs when respondents select the first acceptable response from a list rather than the best. Okay, so this happens particularly when respondents are quickly going through a survey. They might not read all of the response options and simply choose the first one they come to that might be acceptable. Okay. So again, there are advantages to closed-ended questions, right? They're simple and straightforward, okay, which is good, and they're easy to analyze, like I said. But one of the potential problems of closed-ended questions is that they may not be accurate if we only ask one question, right? So what if the person misunderstands the question? What if one question doesn't capture the complexity of the measured variable, right? So often what we do to potentially solve this problem is we use a scale to measure our variables. So scales consist of a series of close-ended questions, and the researcher simply sums up the participants' responses to create a score, right? And this particular score is going to index the degree to which our respondent possesses or exhibits whatever variable we're trying to assess, right? So let me show you an example. Okay, so here is the self-concept clarity scale. So if you were a respondent filling out this questionnaire, your instructions would be to answer each question according to the way you personally feel using the scale. So you would place an answer in the form of a number next to each question, right? So for this particular scale, your set of responses are measured from 1 to 5, and they index the degree to which you agree with a particular statement, right? So for example, my beliefs about myself often conflict with one another, right? So whether or not you think that is true of yourself, you would choose the number that most appropriately describes you, right? So if you strongly disagree with that statement, you would put a 1. If you strongly agree with that statement, you would put a 5, right? So again, all of these questions are essentially asking the same thing, right? So my beliefs about myself often conflict with one another. Sometimes I feel that I am not really the person I appear to be. My beliefs about myself seem to change very frequently, right? So essentially, all of these questions are asking for the same information, right? But they're just phrased in a slightly different way. So the value of scales in this case is if for some reason, right, the respondent doesn't understand the question, or the question is too simplistic to capture some of the nuances of self-concept clarity, then instead of asking one question, we have 12 questions that are getting at the essence of self-concept clarity, but are not identical to each other. Okay, so one of the most common types of measurement scales we use for surveys are called Likert scales. Okay, so with a Likert scale, a participant evaluates a series of statements using a predetermined set of response options, right? So it's close-ended. And then those responses are summed up to reflect the overall measurement of the variable, right? And with a Likert scale, we can look at, for example, level of agreement or the degree to which you agree with a statement, the frequency of occurrence, right? So a lot of questionnaires, for example, indexing depression and anxiety, might ask you to evaluate the frequency with which you exhibit a behavior. So for example, I feel hopeless, or I cry, or I feel sad, right? So you might evaluate a similar 4 or 5 point scale where they ask you never, sometimes, often, always, for example, or 0 or no days, 1 to 3 days, 5 to 7 days, etc., to evaluate the frequency of a behavior. Or we might just include the degree to which you approve of something or your overall evaluation of something, right? So the scale I just showed you the self-concept clarity scale is using a Likert scale to measure the degree of self-concept clarity, right? So I wanna make a distinction here. So when we talk about measuring variables on a scale, right? So the self-concept clarity scale, for example, that's referring to a cluster of questions, essentially asking the same thing in a slightly different way. When we talk about a Likert scale, that's the scale that we use to assess or to measure the self-concept. So they're both scales, but they're slightly different types of scales, right? Does that make sense? So we have scales that index, are scales that attempt to measure a variable by asking a variety of different questions, but we also have a Likert scale that attempts to measure the degree to which you possess a particular construct. But we also have different types of measurement scales we could use. So for example, with a forced choice scale, your respondent is going to be forced to choose between two different response options for each item, right? So for example, true, false. But there's an obvious problem with this type of scale, right? And that's that it's not very sensitive, right? So it doesn't allow us to get much information about the degree to which someone, for example, agrees with a statement, because it's simply sort of a yes or no thing. So it's minimally sensitive, and it also invokes this kind of forced determinism, right? So how often, for example, is something true and always true, or false and always false, right? Most of the time it's true in some contexts and false in other contexts, right? So if we really want to get an accurate and appropriately nuanced sense of how a respondent feels about a particular or the degree to which they exhibit a particular variable, we need to employ a scale that's more sensitive and allows for variation rather than something always or never being true. Okay, so like I said, Likert scales have a lot of advantages, but they also impose problems, right? So one of those problems is something called the error of central tendency. So the error of central tendency is the tendency for respondents to place most items in the middle of a rating scale rather than choosing the most extreme cases. Right? So they tend to respond somewhere in the middle rather than choosing the extreme responses at either end of the scale. Right? Likert scales are particularly likely to invoke this tendency. So a plain Likert scale might encourage our respondents to go in the middle rather than choosing the most extreme options, right? So what are some ways that we can prevent our respondents from automatically going to the centermost option? Well, one of the easiest ways we can do this is by making sure that our questions are clear and make sense to the respondent, right? So if our respondent doesn't really know what the question is asking, they're much more likely to go for the central or middle option. We also don't want to ask our respondents to provide a justification for higher or lower ratings, because that's going to make them much more likely to choose the center option, especially if they're not able to express why they chose the more extreme options, either on the lower end or upper end of the scale. Right? So for example, a lot of employee performance scales require a manager to provide written justification when evaluating employees on a higher scale. And if they don't, they're not able to necessarily verbalize, or they have a sense that this employee has been performing well, but they can't necessarily come up with specific examples in that moment, especially if they're doing performance evaluations maybe every day or every week, then they're much more likely to choose the middle option rather than the extremes. So if we're concerned about that situation, then we would want to remove that justification. Another simple option is simply to leave out the center items, right? So for example, if we're administering our questionnaire on a scale from 1 to 5, then maybe we leave out the 3, right? And they have to choose the 1 or the 5. So it forces them to take a more extreme position. Okay, so this concludes our discussion about how we operationalize our variables for survey research and create or construct a hypothesis and begin to consider how we might ask our particular survey questions. And like I said, measure them for how they're going to be constructed in our survey, right? So in my final video, I'm going to go through the actual questions that we might administer in a survey like this, and we're going to evaluate them for whether they are effective questions or ineffective questions, and we're also going to see the results. So this was an actual correlational study that was conducted, so you will be able to see whether there's a positive correlation between self-concept, clarity, and desire to join a Greek organization, or a negative correlation. Okay? All right, so I'll see you in my next video.